Okay, so we're going to have a look at the skull and face and the skeleton of the skull and face, so the bony structure of the skull and face. We'll treat the skull and the face quite separately. So initially we're going to have a look at the skull itself, or what's known as the Calvarium. And the Calvarium is made up of the frontal bone, a single frontal bone, two parietal bones, two temporal bones, one occipital bone, one sphenoid bone, and one ethmoid bone. Okay, so let's just start thinking about looking at the skull from the anterior or projection, so we can get to know some of the anatomy and look at the way in which the bones articulate with each other. Okay, so superiorly we have the frontal bone. Okay, so the frontal bone here highlighted in green. So it forms the anterior aspect of the calvarium, but also note how the frontal bone forms part of the roof of the orbit. We will look at the orbit and the nasal cavity quite separately. So that's the frontal bone itself. Now you can see at the medial margin of the superior border of the orbit itself, there is a small indentation, and that indentation is known as the superciliary, the supraorbital notch. Okay, sometimes it's actually, if I put a little diagram in here, so we can see here the supraorbital notch. Okay, and sometimes that's actually a foramen, so it can either be a small notch or it can be a foramen, so an enclosed circle. So that's known as the supraorbital notch. Okay, I said that this is the superior border of the orbit itself. Okay, and this ridge here is often known as the supraorbital, the superciliary arch. Okay, the superciliary arch. Okay, and the superciliary arch meet in the middle at this bony prominence here known as the glabella. Okay, think about the superciliary arch almost at the point where your eyebrows are, in a sense. You can feel that arch where your eyebrows are, that superciliary arch there, and they meet anteriorly at the glabella. Okay, so if we go back to the skull itself, now let's have a look here, and we've got the nasal bone, the left and the right nasal bone. So the right and left nasal bones articulate with the frontal bone. They also articulate here with the maxilla. So you have the right maxilla and the left maxilla. Okay? So we can see that the maxilla here articulates with the nasal bone superiorly. Okay? Articulates here with the nasal bone superiorly. It also forms part of the infraorbital margin, or the edge of the margin of the orbit itself. So the maxillas form in part of the infraorbital margin. Okay, it also articulates here with the nasal bone. Okay, we can see that the lower margin of the maxilla, the left and right maxilla, holds the dentition, or the upper dentition. Okay, and we can see here that the maxilla on both sides has a small projection which articulates with the zygomatic bone. Okay, and this is the zygomatic bone here. Okay, and the zygomatic bone there. Okay, so that's the left and the right maxilla. So we have a pair of maxillae, a right and a left. Okay, then if we come down, Sorry, let's get rid of those. Done. Okay, for some reason I can't get rid of it. Okay, so inferiorly then we have the mandible itself. Ooh, sorry. Okay. So down here. We have the mandible. Okay, so what we've had a look at so far is simply orientation, is the frontal bone up here. Okay, frontal bone. We've looked at the nasal bone, okay, the left and the right nasal bone. We've also looked at the left and the right maxilla, the maxilla containing the upper dentition, and we've also had a look at the mandible itself. Okay, now we are not going to have a close look at this point at the orbits. Okay, we'll have a very detailed look at the orbits themselves, and we'll also have a detailed look at the nasal cavity. Okay, but so far what we've talked about the orbit is that the frontal bone forms the supraorbital margin, and the frontal bone also forms part of the roof of the orbit. We've also talked about the maxilla forming part of the infraorbital margin and forming part of the floor of the orbit. And lastly, let's have a look at the nasal cavity. You can see that there's this distinct plate within the nasal cavity, and that is made up superiorly by the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, and inferiorly it's made up of the voma, a single bone. Okay, ethmoid a single bone, voma a single bone. Okay, and that's our anterior look at the bones of the skull and how they articulate with each other.